That's good. We're getting the audience in. I think we're ready to start. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us. Thank you for joining us today for our first Path Live Forum of 2025-2026, Staying Ahead of Anti-Malaria Drug Resistance, where we will explore how anti-malaria drug resistance and real-world use shape treatment policy decisions and guide drug development and the approaches countries are taking to protect decades of progress and keep our communities safe. My name is Dr. Henry Ntuku. I'm Research and Program Advisor for Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases at PATH, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's conversation. Before we start, I think we gotta give special thanks to GSK Global Health for their support in making today's PATH live forum possible. Before diving in, we'll start by going over a few logistics. We are pleased to offer interpretation in French for today's webinar. To follow along in either English or French, please select the channel of your preferred language using the interpretation button in the toolbar. We want to hear from you during this conversation, so please introduce yourselves using the chat, and you can share your questions and comment with us by submitting them in either the chat or the Q&A box at any time throughout this discussion. I will be monitoring your questions and will be saving some time at the end of the hour for an audience Q&A. And then for a final note on logistics, we are grateful to have participants joining us from all over the world today. For those unable to attend, this call is being recorded and will be distributed for future viewing. As an overview of our session today, I will introduce our panelists and then I will briefly frame the conversation before diving into facilitated Q&A with each of our panelists. We are honored today to be joined by an amazing group of health leaders, researchers, and public health specialists. So we have today Professor Philippe Guerin, who is the director of the Worldwide Antimalarial Resistance Network and the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory. And we also have Pierre Higo, who is the Vice President of Access and Product Management at Medicines for Malaria Ventures. And then third, we have Professor Deus Ishangoma, who is Principal Research Scientist at the Fakara Health Institute and the National Institute for Medical Research. And last but not least, we have Dr. Rima Shreter, Senior Principal Technical Advisor and Project Director for the Stop EMDR project at JPIGO. Thank you all for being with us today, and we appreciate your time. We will hear from our panel in just a moment, but first, I would like to take a few minutes to set the scene for today's conversation. I think because before we can talk about how to stay ahead of anti-malaria drug resistance, we need to understand the essential role of anti-malarial drugs in the fight against malaria and the factors that impact their efficacy. Artemisinin-based combination therapies, or ACTs, they've been the backbone of malaria case management for more than 2 decades. Since their introduction, they have saved millions of lives, and they continue to remain highly effective in most settings today. ACTs are made of 2 drugs. So there's the artemisinin component that rapidly reduces parasite levels, but it is cleared from the blood very quickly. The second component is the longer-acting partner drugs that helps clear any remaining parasites and also remains longer in the bloodstream. Their introduction has helped transform malaria case management, and their efficacy has been essential to malaria control efforts around the world. But as with any widely used medicine, the long-term effectiveness of ACTs depends not only on the drugs themselves, but also on how they are used in real-world settings. We are seeing evolving patterns in malaria parasite mutations associated with drug resistance in a growing number of countries that are affecting both artemisinin and partner drugs. At the same time, a number of other factors can influence how well these medicines work in practice. So these will include, just to name a few, gaps in malaria surveillance, whether a patient can quickly access accurate diagnosis and treatment services, or how well they adhere to a full course of treatment, and the quality of medicines available, just to name some of those factors. When taken together, these factors shape not just individual outcomes, but creates population-level vulnerability that impact the long-term effectiveness of these life-saving treatments. This raises now some important questions for us to consider. How do we stay ahead of this growing trend in drug resistance? As public health systems are under increasing pressure, how does resistance shape treatment policies and do better protect the effectiveness of existing treatments? And what might these trends mean for the next generation of treatment? Today's conversation will help us explore these questions as each of our speakers offers insight into global trends, country-level implementation, and policy market shaping strategies to help safeguard the effectiveness of ACTs. With that, I would like to turn to our first speaker. I will start with Professor Philippe Guerin. Philippe, I would like to start with you. Through your work with the Worldwide Antimalarial Resistance Network and Infectious Diseases Data Observatory, you are tracking the changing landscape of anti-malaria drug resistance across Africa and Asia. What are the most important resistance trends that we are seeing today, and how should the global community interpret these signals?
Sorry. Thank you, Henry. And first, thank you for the PAF team for inviting me for this seminar. So if we can move forward, I've got a few slides to try to illustrate where we are. So next slide. So one thing, and I'm starting with an acknowledgement of a large team of people who have been over the years helping collating information around markers of resistance in actually all endemic countries from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Next slide. So as you all know, we are having a problem of artemisinin resistance and potentially of partner drugs. And right now, the challenge is really to know where it is and do we have this information in a manner that can be interpreted by policymakers. So one thing that we have done for now more than 15 years at Warn EDO has been to collate all the information which are publicly available. So it's a mix of publications, but also in some instances, colleagues who have been sharing this information in when they are not published. And we collect this information in what we call the surveyors. And so we've got a surveyors for K13 for the markers associated with SP resistance and the associated markers associated with the partner drugs. Next slide. So what we have tried is to use all this data and developing a spatial temporal Gaussian model that will help us estimating how this resistance is developing, either emerging or spreading across the different region. Next one. What the model can do is to describe what is happening. It can make forecasts based on the current trend, but we need to be very careful in, like any models, it doesn't predict the future. It sort of say, okay, if things continue to evolve in the same way, this is likely what we will see in the near future. with all the caveat that it associated with this kind of exercise. But it can also help us understanding where resistance is, where we have information and we don't have information, and eventually guide surveillance. So next one. And very briefly, I'm going to illustrate that by, and you see there is a rolling date next to the case 13 surveyor. So this is Southeast Asia, and we started the surveillance in early 2000. And this is where the data are sort of predicting where resistance is. Now, people who know that region will say, well, you are saying that there is resistance in Thailand, where there is hardly any transmission there. So it's true that we need to interpret these models in the landscape and the current transmission. But it's sort of say how things have evolved in that region, with clearly all the countries around Cambodia, which have now almost a high level of artemisinin resistance, and also some concerns about Myanmar, but the level of surveillance is in that particular country not as good as one would like. Next slide. So what we did, we use that same model and we apply, and you might remember when I was pointing to the surveyor, all the data that exists in Africa, and we are using that model to, again, look at what's the likelihood prevalence of resistance in the region. And then it goes to a prediction until 2028. So if the trends continue, this is what we are expecting. So coming from resistance of artemisinin in the Great Lake region and then in the Horn of Africa. There is at a lower prevalence now report of resistance of artemisinin in Namibia, the border of Namibia and Angola. Now, artemisinin resistance alone doesn't make a treatment failing. And so what we are really interested in, and we have seen that in Southeast Asia, is that when you go, you move first with artemisinin resistance, you're putting a lot of pressure essentially to the partner drugs, and then the partner drugs may subsequently also become resistant. And this is the case of what we have seen for mefloquine and pyronaridine not pyronaridine, piperacin in Southeast Asia. Now, the concern for Africa, where we have been using massively artemether lumefantrine, is are we likely to see the same problem? And this concern is completely legitimate. Yet we don't have very, very strong evidence about that. But the next slide. What we have been looking specifically for markers which are not very good markers of either lumefantrine or amodiaquine resistance. We have seen over the years an evolution where when over time the treatment had moved away from chloroquine and then extending the treatment using mostly artemether lumefantrine, we have seen that we have regained to some extent sensitivity to the 4-aminoquinoline like amodiaquine, and this is the left side map of the K76T PFCRT prevalence. And to some extent, that gives us an indication that this change happened over time because we are actually creating drug pressure. So this is the basis that tells us now, because we have regained probably a lot of sensitivity to the amodiaquine compound, the idea of now mixing, and Rima will surely talk about that, multiple first line is a way to mitigate the selection of a resistance to a particular partner drugs, in that case, lumefantrine. It's also, in that case, the rationale for developing a triple therapy, which is essentially associating an artemisinin-based combination therapy, lumefantrine and amodiaquine, and that's a work which is ongoing with the expected availability of the triple therapy later next year or early 2027. So this surveillance is critical. Now, we need to be careful. There are not that much data, and clearly in some region, we don't have enough data. I'm stopping there. Henry?
Yeah, thank you very much, Philippe. This is really interesting to hear about the surveyor and the use of models and the need for more data. So I just wanted to build up on that. Like, what are some of the key challenges the malaria community faces in capturing resistance data, and where do we see the biggest gaps when it comes to translating available data into practice? And how can countries better gather and use resistance and efficacy surveillance data to inform treatment policy and protect effectiveness of ACTs?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of the colleagues who have joined are from National Malaria Control Program, and to some extent, for them is that okay, all these models are great, and this collation of information looks beautiful on a map. What do we do with that? Well, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that in some region there have been substantial effort to generate this kind of data, which are informative. If you know that there is artemisinin resistance, if you know that potentially there are a selection of specific markers of resistance, that's going to be extremely important to act upon it. And then multiple first line is a solution. Then later on, either the triple therapy that I was mentioning or new combination. But it also highlights that in some regions we have very few data, or data are very old, and this is one of the problems. And if you can put again the map, it's illustrated by the fact that when we select only on the last few years, we've got a lot less data available to actually. So it's the next slide. To really, yes, this one. So basically, we have selected data from 2021 till now. So lots of attention in the Great Lake region, but actually the surveillance is not as good in all the other regions. And so we need to put more attention. There is an increasing capacity of doing that in Africa, but not everywhere. And I think that's one of the challenges. And the second challenge that we have been talking for years is that the access to this information are actually happening years after the samples have been collected. So it could be 2, 3, 4 years. And why is that so? It's because, well, especially in academia, people want to publish. And so this type of exercise takes time. And I think we need to find, a middle ground here and try to see how we can expedite the release and the dissemination of public health information of importance that could guide policymakers without jeopardizing the work of the colleagues in university who want to publish. And I think what we are, for instance, capturing in Surveyor are very just prevalence data and should not prevent publication. And this information could be actually digested and shared to the community to guide policy. So I think that's the two challenges is having a much better coverage, but also an accelerated way of disseminating that information.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Again, just a reminder to the participants that you can drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A tool, so we'll have time to discuss at the end with Philippe. Thank you very much, Philippe. That's a great transition, actually, moving from surveillance to policies to country, and that allows me to move forward to Deus. Deus, I know you've been closely involved in national efforts to monitor and respond to anti-malaria drug resistance in Tanzania. From your experience, what are the main drivers of anti-malaria drug resistance in Tanzania today, and what should programs be paying closest attention to?
Thank you, Henry, and thanks to the PATH team for inviting me to speak to the webinar today. And I hope everyone can hear me okay. So basically, I wish we knew what are the key drivers of antimalarial drug resistance. We do know about the patterns and the trends of antimalarial drug resistance, but unfortunately, we are unable to pin down what are the key drivers. So historically, we do know that chloroquine and SP resistance first started in East Africa and spread to West Africa. And artemisinin partial resistance is following the same trend. So drivers would be like volumes of drug use or misuse, adherence, compliance, coverage levels of drugs. But I find it hard to tell that we have high drug resistance in East Africa compared to West Africa because of those reasons. So one of the things basically our teams and colleagues have been trying to do is to mine out the information and to be able to tell whether we can understand what essentially drives antimalarial drug resistance. With the recent case of artemisinin partial resistance, we are seeing multiple foci of drug resistance. We already have 4 foci, one in the the Great Lakes of Africa, where we have Uganda, Rwanda and Tanzania, northern Uganda, and then the Horn of Africa. And we recently reported about the one in the Southern Africa, in Angola, Namibia, and Zambia. And when I look at different parameters like population movement, I don't see the differences among the regions. And in Tanzania, we have now confirmed another focus in the southern part of the country near Malawi, and we have no idea why that pattern of sporadic emergence in fossa is happening. So basically, the known drivers of drug resistance, which people will talk about, but in my opinion, my experience, I find it hard to be able to ascribe the current pattern and situation to those drivers. So what that means, we need to do more. We know less than we should be knowing, and therefore more work lies ahead of us. That's how to respond to this question.
Thank you very much, Dios. That's really interesting, and just wanted to take a step further, but just wanting to know how is now Tanzania using the evidence that you gather to drive decision making in its response to antimalarial drug resistance, particularly when it comes to treatment policy and program implementation.
I'll also start historically. Tanzania has changed drug resistance, the drug policies twice successfully. First in 2001, when we changed from chloroquine to SP, that was a transitional policy change because the country was unable to afford expensive ACTs. So we transitionally switched from chloroquine to SP. And in 2006, we switched from SP to Artemisinin-based combination therapy, where we introduced the artemether-lumefantrine, and we have been using that until now. And in an effort to ensure that the public is secured in terms of case management, we have been doing surveillance of drug resistance and therapeutic efficacy studies almost every year since 2007, but more so from 2011. And until 2020, we had no ideas of whether we had problems with the ACT. In 2021, in a study that was done to map the country situation or profile of drug resistance, we identified a focus in northwestern Tanzania in an angle that borders Rwanda in the north, Rwanda in the west, and Uganda in the north, in Kagera region. And we went ahead immediately that starting from early 2022, we did a therapeutic efficacy study, and within 6 months, we were able to confirm that actually Tanzania is the 4th country in Africa to confirm artemisinin partial resistance after Rwanda around 2020, Uganda 2021-22, and Eritrea 2022. So the end of 2022, Tanzania became the 4th country. And we were gratified that we moved very fast to make recommendations to the ministry. And by end of 2023, actually the ministry had made a decision to make a policy change to introduce a modafinil artesunate starting with the regions at high risk. We also had reported failure rates among patients treated with the AL in a coastal region that was actually above 10% in Pwani region. So Pwani and the regions around Lake Victoria were identified for policy change. Everything was moving perfect. Unfortunately, the United States of America government withdrew funding, and the policy change has not progressed to implementation. That is making us sad, but we do pray and hope that things will get back to normal and policy changes will be made. Apart from that, from other angles, we have been pushing to generate a national response for mitigating antimalarial drug resistance generally in the entire country, and progress is really well advanced. What I could say, Tanzania, and my experience, has been one of the great examples in using evidence generated by researchers to influence policy and decisions. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much. That was interesting. Just shedding the light on how evidence is being used in country for policy change and adapting to the evolving situation. And that actually takes us to our next speaker, Rima. Rima, your work leading the United-funded Stop MDR project is focusing on minimizing the threats and the impact of antimalarial drug resistance in Africa. Can you share how approaches like multiple first-line therapies, MFT, are being implemented and what they are aimed to achieve in protecting ACT effectiveness?
Sure, thank you so much. And thank you also to the PATH team for inviting me today, and thank you to everyone that has logged in today to contribute to the conversation. So as the speakers before me have mentioned, a major driver of the threat to drug resistance is that heavy reliance on a particular single ACT, artemether-lumefantrine, which accounts for more than 80% of treatments used in Africa today. And when one drug combination dominates the market to that extent, it increases selection pressure and accelerates resistance. And recognizing this, Unitaid and Jhpiego launched the Stop AMDR project last year, a 4-year initiative aimed at minimizing the threat and impact of antimalarial drug resistance. The project actually operates in 6 core countries, DRC, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda, as well as Burkina Faso and Kenya that have already started with implementation. At the heart of the project, as you mentioned, is the introduction of multiple first-line therapies, or MFT, which involves the use of 2 or more effective ACTs simultaneously or in rotation as first-line treatments for uncomplicated malaria. And the goal is quite straightforward. By diversifying the ACTs used across the population, we reduce the reliance on any single drug combination, slowing the selection of drug resistance parasites and prolonging the effectiveness of ACTs. So, for example, Rwanda and DRC are implementing a rotational strategy, as well as geographical segregation. Rwanda is doing a 1-year strategy. Others are focusing on 2 years. Burkina Faso and Kenya are also doing rotation. Uganda is using a combination of simultaneous, where under 5s are using one product, over 5s another, and then in another district doing a rotation every 2 years. And Nigeria, another one of our countries, is doing simultaneous across 3 age groups, so under 5s, 5 to 12s, and then 12 and over. So this way, the various populations are exposed to different drugs at the same time to reduce the drug pressure. And to make sort of this multiple first-line therapy treatment happen, the project is working with national malaria control programs to update treatment policies, integrate the newly recommended ACTs, which are on the market but are not being used to a great extent, ASPY and DP, and ensuring that these therapies are available at the public health facilities. At the same time, we're working with the countries to strengthen supply chains and procurement systems to ensure that there's a continuous availability of these products to the patients and providers, while also facilitating some of the market shaping activities that other partners are working on to make these newer ACTs available and affordable. Another key pillar that we're working on is implementation research. So STOP AMDR is conducting feasibility studies to understand how MFT platforms in real-world settings can work. So evaluating the operational practicality, health outcomes, and the costs and potential cost effectiveness of implementing MFTs. And these insights will guide national scale up and ensure that MFT strategies are both effective and sustainable. A really important part of the project is community engagement and demand generation by improving an understanding of why multiple AST options are being used and how they help protect malaria treatments in the long term. But again, and the other way as well, learning from the communities and incorporating that thinking and those challenges in the community in the strategy. And this is important because there are no new treatments available or expected at least until 2027, which means that the current ACTs that we rely on must remain effective as long as possible. And MFT is one of the strongest tools we currently have to achieve that. So in short, by diversifying ACT use, strengthening health systems, and generating vital evidence, we're working with the countries I mentioned and a broader set of countries to stay ahead of the drug resistance game. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Rima. Yeah, approaches like MFT definitely requires some key considerations in country to be able to implement it. So from your perspective, what are the key operational and policy considerations countries need to consider to break down barriers and devise lasting solutions to anti-malaria drug resistance?
Thanks. And there's no doubt that diversifying ACTs or diversifying treatments helps to protect the treatment. So that's not the problem. But as you can imagine, it's the policy and operational conditions that create the greatest challenges and are key to developing those successful solutions to antimalarial drug resistance. So I'd say in terms of policy, obviously updating national policies to support ACT diversification by revising treatment guidelines to include multiple WHO recommended first-line therapies, which includes policy changes to allow the simultaneous or rotational use of different ACTs at the national and subnational levels. Another potential market barrier is drug registration and regulation. In many countries, these newer ACTs remain unavailable and unaffordable, sometimes due to slower regulatory processes. And one of the things that policymakers can do is fast track that registration of the newly recommended ACTs and align procurement rules with regulatory pathways to ensure that these diversified ACTs can be purchased, supplied, and used in routine programs. The other policy challenge could be the integration of MFT into long-term strategies. So embedding MFTs within the broader national malaria strategic plans, securing ongoing financing, particularly in the current global arena that we're in, and then establishing clear transition plans so that the programs can go from pilot to national scale in a short period of time. Obviously, there's a large number of stakeholders that work across these areas, so strengthening that governance and coordination across malaria programs, ministries of health, private sector partners, and civil society and communities. In terms of operational considerations, it's a huge part of it is reinforcing the supply chain systems for multiple ACTs, which means that, a lot of the public health systems are not currently designed for this. So it's a challenge for countries, and countries are working very hard to strengthening forecasting of procurement of more than one first-line treatment, diversifying their suppliers to ensure supplier security, ensuring that reliable availability at the facility level to prevent stockouts, and improving affordability through market shaping activities. So We, as a project, are working with other partners, both on this call and outside, to help to aggregate demand numbers, shape markets to lower ACT prices, improve procurement efficiency as well. And then, as I mentioned previously, is that investing in implementation, research, and monitoring. So countries really need that real-world evidence to guide policy decisions. And we're working on demonstration studies to look at feasibility of MFT. How much does it actually cost? Do MFTs cost more, given that more than one drug is in the system at the same time? Are some of the issues around logistics and operations more expensive than just one? We're not sure yet, but we're collecting data on that. And then again, the data on the impact on resistance dynamics, which is really essential for national adoption and long-term integration. And then importantly is health system preparedness. So updated clinical guidelines, training for health workers, retraining of the health workers, facility level distribution systems, and increasing engagement to ensure that we have that strengthened community acceptance. Importantly, recognizing some of the folks that we have on this call when we talked about surveillance and pharmacovigilance, so strengthened drug resistance surveillance through tracking of molecular markers, as Philippe mentioned, therapeutic efficacy monitoring, so knowing what those resistance markers mean to clinical efficacy of the drugs, and they're not necessarily a linear correlation. And importantly, tracking ACT use patterns. So knowing how ACT use patterns impact molecular markers of resistance, which impact clinical effectiveness. And all of these items that I mentioned, both in terms of policy and operations, are critical, as partial Artemisinin resistance is already documented in multiple regions, as other speakers before me have mentioned. I hope that answers your question, Henry. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Rima. That was indeed very interesting. And again, I'm sure we'll have some time at the end during the Q&A to dig more a bit into some of these points. That's again, thank you very much, Rima. Turning over to you, Pierre. I know we've been saying it. I mean, it's clear that part of the answer to this threat is using, like in a better way, the current tools that we have, but also looking into new products. I know we all know Medicine for Malaria Venture is also looking at not only the existing portfolio of ACT on the market, but also the pipeline for novel treatment for malaria. How are the anti-malaria resistant trends shaping the way that we think about deploying existing anti-malaria medicines and the need for new ones, Pierre?
Thanks, Henry, for the question. Likewise, thanks to Peth for the invitation, and to my previous speakers. I think they've a great overview in terms of setting the scene and also some of the real challenges that countries are facing or we facing. Probably start off with a bit of a mind shift and change. And antimalarial resistance, it's not just a clinical problem, it's a systems problem. To Rima's points, it's I think it's also forcing us how to rethink how we deploy antimalarial tools that we've got. For years, the sort of approach has been use highly effective treatments, scale them, and then switch when they fail. But that model is no longer enough, or that approach is no longer enough, because by the time failure is visible, resistance is already widespread, and we've seen that in Southeast Asia. So, with regards to resistance trends, I think there are three trends that are shaping some of the thinking. One is partial Artemisinin resistance is now confirmed. Africa, in fact, carries the highest burden of malaria, and it's that's a real global consequence. In terms of drug efficacy, the decline is more subtle. So we're no longer seeing sudden treatment failures. We've seen delayed parasite clearance. And in real world as some of the speakers have just said, real world conditions make it difficult to address resistance. So resistance is not just biological, it's operational. So how can countries, in terms of address incomplete adherence, stock outs, as we saw during COVID, making sure that quality drugs are being used, and in the right, high transmission settings. In terms of how does that help reshape our thinking, I think shifting from reactive to more of a proactive deployment of drugs, countries being able to detect and act quickly on early warning signs, using surveillance data, also looking at preemptive policy shifts. So, how quickly can policy change, and being able to protect, drug efficacy becomes that priority. So in terms of, ACTs are still highly effective, but they're vulnerable. So we need to manage them. And in terms of optimizing dose adherence, reducing misuse, I think that's, those are some of the quick fixes. In terms of the MFT approaches, absolutely, that's part of the strategy, the AMDR strategy. But then, moving towards a more diversified treatment strategy. So, not just the one size fits all approach is important. And then looking at, the new drugs and how that shapes some of our thinking. So I think new drugs are no longer a backup, they're essential. If we look at the new therapies, and trying to stay ahead and not just play a catch-up game, I think really exciting to see. For the last 20 years, we haven't had new drugs. But now this next generation of drugs are going to be available within the next year or two. So, that's important. If you look at supporting that strategic introduction of the new drugs, it gives us options around rotation, deployment of the new drugs. So it gives us different choices. And then from an innovation perspective, it's not just about killing the parasites. The new drugs also need to look at, simplified dosing, so single dose cures, improved adherence, reduced transmission, and taking that strategic shifts. So overall, resistance is forcing, you could say, this fundamental shift. It's treating malaria not as a clinical problem, but more as a long-term sort of resistance risk. And ultimately, how do we use the treatments, save the treatments we've got today, so that we're saving the lives for tomorrow, is I suppose a good close off. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. Interesting to hear how this challenge, this threat is sort of shaping the drug development. I think I wanted to build on that and just asking, looking ahead, how is the drug development pipeline evolving to respond to these challenges? And what role do new and next generation drugs can play in addressing emerging challenges?
So I think what's exciting is that today, you could say that the pipeline is fundamentally changing, you could say in three ways. So moving beyond artemisinin dependence. So we see new classes of drugs that are going to be coming to market. So ganaplacide, for example, manufactured by Novartis, it's a first in class. So, and once again, we haven't, this has been 20 years. So, high risk with drug development. You could say very timely that the new compounds are coming to market. They target parasites differently. They reduce this sort of risk of cross resistance. Also, combination therapies are getting smarter. So we're not just looking at combining drugs anymore. We're looking at how we could re-engineer resilience. So you've got dual therapies like inipside, lumefantrine that show, very, very high efficacy rates or cure rates. We've got triple ACTs that have been explored to look at how they can extend the drug lifespan, which is really important. So durability of the current drugs. And looking at targeting transmission, not just cure. So, how can the next generation of drugs be designed to kill parasites faster, block transmission from a gametocyte standpoint, potentially support elimination strategies, obviously critical. And then what else? So we've got also further down the line, really exciting candidates, single dose cures that'll be coming to market post 2030. So you could say, the future is bright from a drug development standpoint, but in terms of, staying ahead of resistance, the new drugs, you could say, are not a luxury, that they an insurance. It allows us to rotate, combine, protect treatments before failure occurs. Extending the life of existing therapies, obviously critical. So partner drugs like lumefantrine are still matter. Long half-life helps clear the parasites, act to protect the combination drug. And the future is not just replacing everything, it's building on strong combinations. And enabling these new strategies, so the next generation drugs, to unlock where they can be used from a preventative use standpoint or strategically deployment in these high resistance areas. It gives countries options, not just so I think that's important. And then the real challenge, it's not just all about the science. Yes, we've got the pipeline, but with innovation alone, we're not just going to address MDR. So the real gap is, the funding for the deployment, country implementation, policy agility, and access at scale. That's what counts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That's indeed interesting. And thanks to all our panelists today for providing such important insights from surveillance to country policies to new developments. I think we can dive into some of the questions that are coming in. There are interesting ones. Unfortunately, we can't go through all of them, but let me just look at some of the interesting questions that we have. There's an interesting question. I think this one will be for Rima on the cost of introducing MFT, how to introduce MFT so fund can be obtained from Global Fund. And I think there's a related question on the cost of MFT, just taking into account the current situation in terms of funding cuts. How likely can we support or at least have in place the MDR surveys that you just mentioned when we were discussing?
Thanks. So what we know is, so there's the cost of MFTs and then there's the cost of new ACTs. And the new ACTs we know are substantially more expensive than the currently used ones, in orders of magnitude, actually. So, but then again, we're trying to diversify. So incorporating that within the MFT strategies is important. So we can't really separate them, but MFTs by themselves, what we're doing is compiling data to see, is it just the startup cost of a new policy, of a drug policy change, first-line treatment drug policy change, where it's the initial training, the initial changing of guidelines and all of that, or is there operationally a higher cost of MFTs because we're using more than one drug? Now you can imagine that there will be some costs in terms of a reverse supply chain, especially with the rotation where you're trying to take drugs out and bring them back in. So there is that. And then obviously the substantially higher cost of the newer ACT. So there are a lot of market shaping activities that are occurring by Jhpiego and Stop AMDR in collaboration with other partners to volume guarantees, price reduction strategies with suppliers. And I'm not the best person placed to that because there are so many others that are working on those more than we are. But in terms of sort of the overall incorporating the MFTs into the new ACTs into MFTs. Yes, we are. There are a number of initiatives, and we're working very closely with the Global Fund so that their strategic initiative, their catalytic funding, and their access funds are used to support the countries most in need, to help them procure the newer ACTs. And then importantly, as many countries are currently receiving their allocation letters for GC8, so we're working both with the Global Fund, partners, and others to ensure that MFTs and the newer ACTs are being considered in the GC8 applications to the Global Fund for the new funding at the various times that they'll be applying for this funding. And then in terms of the surveillance and AMDR tracking, it's an important point because historically PMI has funded TES, and I don't know whether there's any PMI people or Department of State people on the call, but they are still funding some of them. But again, not knowing what the future will entail, we do need to think about incorporating some of these resistance management strategies within Global Fund grants, but also look at other mechanisms for funding. And we are working with a number of people on advocacy for AMDR strategies, both through existing donors, but also looking at potential innovative financing mechanisms and new sources of funding for some of these strategies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rima. Just looking at, there's an interesting one. I think this one will be for you. You touched a little bit on the drivers of resistance. So there's a good question here asking about the role of unregulated private sector, the role that they can play in the growing resistance. Is there anything some insight you can provide from Tanzania?
Basically, from Tanzania, we do not have evidence of whether private sector and unregulated use of antimalarial drugs might be causing the situation we are seeing. But we do have evidence from elsewhere, like in the Mekong sub-region, that resistance always appeared in areas where they had challenges to attend, challenges of dealing with patients, with the migrant workers and minors. In Africa, we haven't done much, but particularly in areas where we have migratory groups with headsmen, where people move with cattle from one location to another, I think that might be a problem, but we do not have concrete data. And with the private sector, we also don't have data that incriminates them. The main groups that is causing antimalarial drug resistance. As things evolve and we get more information, we should be able to tell you exactly whether different groups are actually responsible for driving the patterns we are seeing. Over.
Thank you very much, Deos. Yeah, that's indeed a very good point. Like the contribution or the relative contribution of the private sector will depend on the size of the private sector. So different countries have private sector of different sizes and obviously and different practices. So the impact will differ from one country to another. There's another good question that I'm checking here. I think this one will be good for you, Philippe, is mainly asking if the public concern of resistance is outpacing the actual trends, and if this concern is driving demand for new medicine when existing drugs remain highly effective. That's a provocative question, but I'll let you answer that, Philippe.
That's a difficult one. I think it's uncertain if the public is really driving the demand. I think the challenge that we have really with resistance is that the drugs, it's not an on-off button where all of a sudden the drugs doesn't work. And that's complex mechanism, especially because we are using combination where things evolve over a period of time and usually years. And I think the signal that we see of resistance are subtle. They don't translate into clinical resistance unless both drugs in the context of ACTs are failing, but that happens after years. And I think we need to actually trigger the alarm when we see that happening. Drug pressure on the same drugs all the time is a bad idea. So this is exactly the rationale for MFT, for new treatment. I think we need to convince the policymakers that we should not wait for the failure of the treatment, but really try to anticipate that as soon as we've got signals and worrying signals, and we see that now in a number of countries in Africa, as was said, we need to think about the next possible policy. And of course, the public is concerned, and they are going to increase the demand. But in between the time when you want to do a new drugs and the development of that and the registration and production of that, we are talking about 10 years to the bare minimum. So I think we've got tools right now that we can allow us to react, and we should use them.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Pierre, I was wondering if you can just say a few words on the second part of that question on how this is driving demand for new drugs.
Sure. Yeah. I think just to also expand or add on to that, I would say it's not really whether there's a demand for new drugs. It's whether we can afford not to have them. But it's a really important question. I think organizations like Global Fund, US State Department, many other partners, they look at it from a market shaping perspective, how they can work with countries to ensure that the new drugs are being able to be introduced, used correctly, brought to market. I think it's, CHI has a demand forecast. MMV is part of that demand forecast funded by the Gates Foundation, and it looks at what are those influencing factors to be able to have a forward visibility on demand. It's really important for the manufacturers. It's important, obviously, for the countries to be able to look and understand what their requirements need to look like as forward planning, especially with grant cycle 8 and going forward. So just a bit of an additional nuance on that.
Thank you very much. I think we are at time. These were interesting conversations, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. Really thank you to all our panelists and all the participants for this great conversation and discussions today. So this discussion highlighted that staying ahead of antimalarial drug resistance is not only about detecting resistance, but also about how we use the tools that we already have, ensuring access, improving adherence, and strengthening stewardship while continuing to invest in the next generation of treatments. So we thank you all for your time today. Thank you to our panelists for sharing those insights and experiences. Thank to our audience. I know we didn't get to all your questions, but I just wanted to remind you that recording and additional resources will be shared to all participants. And obviously, you also have contacts to our panelists, so please feel free to reach out to them if you have specific questions. We also wanted to thank GSK Global Health for making today's conversation possible. And I think with that, we really look forward to continuing this conversation in the future Path Live forums. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and let's keep in touch.